Hi, welcome.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Good. Good. Thanks for joining us today. So I am a big fan of your work, first and foremost. That's how we got here. I believe I was introduced to it last summer, maybe in 2020, when Whetstone made an appeal both publicly and internally to expand our coverage in South Asia,
Yeah.
as it was a part of the world where we were seeing a lot of talent and seeing a lot of interest as well. So that's how I first became acquainted with your work as an anthropologist and as a thinker. And so that is what led us to now your show, forthcoming show this fall, Bad Table Manners. So it's a pleasure to be working with you. But
Likewise.
for the sake of of the people and for an introduction, why don't you start us off by just telling us about your work? And I'm particularly interested in this anthropological component, as that is also a key through line of our work at Whetstone as well.
Yeah, I mean, I do lots of different things, and I was trained as an anthropologist, but left academia soon after graduate school. However, I like to think that everything I still do now, which is primarily working as a storyteller and as a writer, still brings an anthropological lens to it. I write a lot about food and fashion, and I would say that generally I write critiques of the lifestyle industry. More recently, I've been writing about food. It's kind of a new interest because I feel like so many of the questions that I'm interested in, like class and caste, and how those things are sort of upheld through sort of cool trends and ideas in popular culture, hide
Mhm,
behind these topics. So
mhm.
I've been kind of excavating slowly in these two areas with an ethnographic eye, but kind of for a a bigger audience.
Mhm. Let's talk a little about fashion, which we haven't done much of at Whetstone, but I'm interested in that intersection of your work because fundamentally, both food and fashion share an agricultural beginning, as part of the story. So can you talk? I know that you were speaking a little bit more to the class components and maybe some of the cultural elements, but can you say a little bit more about some of the connections that you've made between
Hmm.
those two industries?
Yeah, I was very interested in the identity of the contemporary Indian designer who sort of emerged in the 90s. And I think there's a lot of overlaps between that identity and, let's say, the identity of the food critic in India or
Mhm,
the kind of new age chef.
mhm,
And it's kind of seen as a new creative professional with a lot of promise
mhm,
and power. And it's part of a story about globalizing
mhm,
parts of Indian culture that are very tangible and palatable to a Western audience.
mhm,
So I think in the construction of these new professions, we see a lot of consistencies in how they're made. For example, I would argue that in the making of both, things like caste remain quite relevant, even though they're not often it's not often a subject that is spoken about when you're, let's say, at a fashion show or at a
mhm,
restaurant.
mhm,
But many of the old hierarchies are still present and come up even in these new industries. And then, of course, as you pointed out, the environmental kind of disaster of fashion is something that we're talking about now more. And in this, for the same reason, words like sustainability and low carbon footprint that are used in kind of new food industries are also being used in fashion. So the
mhm,
audience and critics, I would say, are overlapping a
mhm.
lot, and that's kind of nice to see that we can apply the same thinking to two fields that have been previously quite separate.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Um, and let's talk about your show, Bad Table Manners. First, I would like to ask you about the name,
Okay.
and then we can get into more about what your hope or your vision is around this collaboration.
So the name is kind of, I mean, it's obviously a kind of a riff on good table manners, because I certainly lack them. And I would say that a lot of Indians lack them actually, because the idea of good table manners is very colonial,
Mhm.
and it also implies certain kind of properness and etiquette,
Mhm.
which I don't want to perpetuate.
Mhm.
I've actually consciously really want to disrupt.
Mhm.
In India, that's everything from the way we're asked to use cutlery, or
Mhm.
and we obviously eat with our hands. The idea of eating in a course-like fashion, which is quite artificial. We often
Mhm.
eat lots of things at once. The use of the finger bowl is something that I've written about a lot, and I'm quite fascinated by as an object that's still alive, even though it is
Mhm.
obviously hilarious and quite dated. And so bad table manners, I feel like um, arouses a potential for good conversation. I feel like when you have bad table manners, that's when some of the good talk actually begins.
Mhm.
And I think that's what informs my vision for the show to some extent as well. I don't want to have proper conversations. I want to kind of look at the look at how tables are actually set up and who's doing the cooking and the problems in the kitchen. And yeah, I want to unpack those things, which I just don't think is possible when you uphold certain kind of ideas of etiquette and politeness.
100% agree. I love that. And the homie Troy, who is tuning in, also raises an excellent point, which is that it also implies the existence of a table at all, right? In the first place,
Yeah.
when many are eating on the floor. Let's go deeper into this framing. This is interesting to me as someone who has um, studied and made work about my own cultural experience in the US as a Black man growing up in the US South, through our own kind of racialized caste system here in the US. And it raises a lot of interesting questions for me as a creative and a writer tackling a lot of these issues and ideas in a public way, in that audience and intended audience isn't always completely in alignment, right? And it's interesting because on the one hand, sometimes we feel that we're making work to connect directly with a particular audience, and yet the folks who are absorbing that work is
Hmm.
maybe a completely different audience. So, which I'm assigning no judgment to either one, just kind of speaking to sometimes the divergence from the creative perspective to the audience
Hmm.
perspective. So, do you have a sense of who this show is for? Do you have an intended audience for this show?
Do I have an intended audience? Is that the question?
Yeah, like intended. Like, is that part of your thinking as you're thinking about how to compile these stories? Like, are you seeing the audience in a particular way? And if so, what are you saying?
Um, I haven't thought as much about the audience in terms of inclusivity. I mean, I hope that it's for anyone who's sort of interested in these kinds of questions, but I've certainly thought more about the voices that I
Yes.
wanted to represent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's really informed by this kind of experience of being a freelance writer and pitching to uh, conventional white food media
Mm-hmm.
magazines, and having this awareness about what makes a pitch work. When you kind of can feel, I think, after a certain point, when you know that you might get commissioned, and there's a certain kind of formula that lies behind that pitch, and it's
Mm-hmm.
often things that maintain certain kind of timeless, exotic place. And so often it's either writing about an ancient food tradition, or it's
Mm-hmm.
writing about something that doesn't threaten Western modernity too much,
Mm-hmm.
or it's something that doesn't make room for the super mundane conversations about food that we have every day. And that's something that I've thought about a lot, and I really wish to make that kind of an important part of the show. And I think there might be a risk of these conversations being quite slow, because often if you talk to people who spend their lives cooking, it's like I chop and I clean and I chop and I clean, and but I feel like that's okay. I mean, I feel
Yeah,
like it's time to shed light on that, and I'm not in, I'm not trying to create a super entertaining podcast. I'm trying to kind of bring out the stories that are on the ground.
yeah.
So yeah.
I love that answer so much. I'm also thinking that many of us have a newfound humility after quarantining for extended periods of time, cooking at home, doing our own dishes. Hopefully, people felt some humility after that experience. I really love what you're speaking on in terms of kind of traditional prerequisites to get other kinds of foods covered and talked about. The only way to move beyond a European gaze of food would be for a new particular region or culture to be presented as exotic. It had to be new. It had to be something spectacular beyond just the daily constitution and the culture of convening and breaking bread. Um, I I'm interested in kind of how, if at all, your idea for capturing these kind of quiet daily moments um, has evolved over the last year. Um, with the pandemic kind of taking hold of the world. Have any of your own observations, ideas about food, or the way that you want to document or bring this pandemic into your work? Like, are you seeing a shift in your thinking or some new ideas in your thinking um, as it relates to the public health crisis?
Have my observations about food kind of shifted in the last year? And do you mean specifically in relationship to the pandemic, or just kind of?
Exactly in relationship to the pandemic, and if so, have you thought about how that might be reflected in your work as well?
Uh, yeah, a little bit, but I think it's kind of connected to a broader observation about resistances to globalization.
Mhm,
So I've been thinking a lot about how offline shopping, for example, in India is, or most of South Asia, still continues to be undeniable, despite the arguments against it, especially during the pandemic, right? This whole
mhm,
idea of like touching food and like, when you're shopping, on the street, and the guy across from the cart is selling things to you. There's a lot of, it's very intimate process, right? And there's a
mhm,
lot of conversation also involved in that exchange.
mhm,
And the argument to kind of shop online is very compelling, but we
mhm,
still continue to go out into the street, and there's a lot of small little rituals that are associated with that, which are very rich. Like, for example, you're likely to get something free, right? Like if you're buying like eggplant or
mhm,
potatoes, right? They often like throw in a little bit of coriander or chili as a
mhm,
kind of loyalty, thank you
mhm,
situation, right? And for me, that's a kind of very powerful anti-capitalist practice that tells
mhm,
you that there's something outside of the system that you and me, the grocer, will continue to do. And I love the way in which those things continue to live on despite
mhm,
the super convenient supermarket kind of lifestyle that we've all um, succumbed to. So that's kind of like the shopping aspect. But of course, I'm also interested in restaurants and bars that have just, like everywhere else in the world, had a very, very difficult year. And I think that that tells you a lot about what it takes to really make it into the restaurant world here and sustain, which, going back to the fashion conversation, has so much to do with other things, such as where you come from, what your
mhm.
background is, and maybe not so much to do with how good your food is, but your power to kind of build a safety net. And
Yeah,
I think those conversations are very important as well this year.
yeah. I totally feel that. We would love for more people to get hip to the idea of buying food directly from those who grow it is possibly the most disruptive anti-capitalist activity and behavior
Yeah.
that one can engage in. Um, Here in the States, I think that a lot of um, the dialogue in food culture around that idea has been unfortunately co-opted or misunderstood to be a dialogue around class exclusively. So who is it for? Also, the ways and places in which farmers markets show up in the U.S. are not in neighborhoods that otherwise, well, they're not in neighborhoods that um, where poor people live, right? And so the idea of buying directly from a farmer, it's not in our formal education. It's not really outside of the schools in our aftercare program. Oftentimes,
Yeah.
those meals are subsidized by government and corporations. And then we see for the folks who need it most, it's these opportunities aren't in their communities as well. They're not in these farmers markets aren't available. And so what's happened is it has really neutered and neutralized what should be a galvanizing force, in terms of food equity and access. But those who are most impacted feel this is actually not for us. This is frankly for
Yeah.
white people, right? So we are trying to with Whetstone, I think largely activate that space in people and that idea in people, that really this is not a class thing and that all of our collective cultures and histories and ancestries
Right.
um, contain open air marketplaces, right? Contain like bartering and eating locally and eating in season and so on. So I feel that observation and I feel align with you in wanting to make work that reflects the potential power um, as a source of revolution too. Kind of relatedly, I want to ask you about the farmers' protests in India and how really those conditions, which were building even before the pandemic, um, how that movement, which is again an agrarian based movement for justice, um, where, like, can you give us kind of a sense of where things stand now with that? And what, if anything, you've observed about this particular movement that made it such a big story nationally, as opposed to these movements which have been happening, for
Yeah,
years in advance?
well, I think it was the kind of relevance of it globally was so powerful, right? I mean, at some point, I think Rihanna tweeted about it, and it was like a huge deal here, right? And what that told me was that it was not about a, a couple of thousand farmers in India. It was about neoliberalism and
Mm,
what it does to traditional supply chains, particularly the middleman, right? I mean, that's really kind of what this debate has come down to, because there's a lot of informal work that's involved in the non-professionalized digitized supply chain,
mhm,
and this neoliberal regime threatens that kind of way of working. And I don't know a lot about this, but it's certainly actually where I plan to maybe end season one, because uh, I thought that maybe ending with the idea of the seed was for me kind of optimistic, because I think there's a possibility of real resistance there. I mean, there's still protests as we speak. It's an ongoing, less visible movement, but it's still very, very powerful. And I think it will continue to be, because it's not only about agriculture, it's about a certain kind of system that's in power, that's being brought into the nation with a few people in mind. So I feel like that resistance will go on, and it's something that I want to kind of sink my teeth into much deeper. And the
mhm,
way to do that would really be to spend time at at the site of protest.
mhm,
There's a lot of kind of amazing stuff that's been written about the generosity of food distribution there.
Mm,
And I've had a lot of friends at the site who have just told me that you're kind of fed constantly, and the resilience that the farmers show is just incredible and heartbreaking.
yeah,
Um, so I think I think it's important to look at everything that's being done there and how it's an alternative form of living while resisting, and of course without kind of romanticizing it too much, because we can't forget how brutal the kind of cold winter nights were and the protests that went on through that time with very little support. So yeah,
yeah.
it's something that I need to look into, and it's definitely in the plan to do that.
Yeah, I think so much of our work as well is about new narratives around farming and agriculture. The really romantic notion that we have of farmers here in the States and in the West has been just as problematic at perpetuating land theft, at perpetuating further divestment in diverse agricultural communities and really consolidated larger family farms
Yeah,
to the benefit of fewer and fewer people. And so I think part of the reason that farms broadly, and I can really only speak with more authority in the US, um, kind of evade scrutiny in their role in these systems of power is because we don't really understand what farms are, you know,
yeah,
and the notion that we have of farms is so closely tied to this infantile, romanticized, racialized vision of who gets to be a farmer on the land. So is that or like can you speak to if you see any similarities to this dynamic in India and just um, how we might go about trying to create more complete narratives around what it means to be a farmer and who actually gets to be a farmer.
yeah. And often I wonder what the job of someone like an anthropologist or an ethnographer or storyteller is in this case, because they're extremely articulate, and I mean, it's not even
Speak to
in a,
that.
I mean, I feel like I'm in a grad school class sometimes when I hear their interviews, right? Because there's no other words that they're not, there's nothing that needs to be elevated. It's
Right.
theoretical, it's experience based, it's truly everything that one would even desire if they needed to kind of reformulate it for a global audience. So I think the job of the storyteller there is just to record and make sure the voices are heard. I don't even see any need for intervention. I feel like that's another place in which things should be consumed directly. It's not,
Mhm.
it's not, I'm another listener, and possibly my responsibility is to record and disseminate, but certainly not to edit or mediate or anything like that. So um, I think that would be the best way to go about that episode and that understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, that is honestly such a beautiful and perfect answer that we can just stop it right there. I think that perfectly really encapsulates our goals, is really as we try to build power and capacity as a media company, it is not our job to filter or translate for people. It is our job to really pass the mic, with the platform that we're building. So thank you for naming that. Okay, anything else you want to leave us with before you take off?
Can you just repeat that last thing? Because my internet was jumping a little bit. What was the last thing you said?
Oh, I think I was actually just praising you. But I
Okay, I missed that. Yeah.
I was basically just commending you on that last answer, which, I feel is really powerful. That is a powerful notion of understanding what our role is in
Yeah.
this in this work, and I think too often um, journalists and anthropologists have misunderstood their role in the work as translators,
Yeah.
and that's not really what it is. It's about amplification and passing off the mic. So really align with you in that point. And I
Yeah,
just
and I
wanted
think
to.
you did. I think I mean, High on the Hog is such a great way of doing that, and I think a lot of people talked about the pitch of your voice on that show, and it's something that I thought about, but to think about what it does in the larger context of actually being able to hear other people was really, I think, so important, and it's something that I think about a lot now as I consume podcasts of just even things like the volume that you're speaking at and how
Mhm,
much room you take up and why.
mhm, mhm.
So yeah, so I think that was
I appreciate that. That's very generous. Well, Meher, we're ecstatic to be working with you, and y'all can all follow Meher on IG and follow us. Please
yeah,
continue to tell your friends and family and loved ones and enemies about our crowdfunding campaign. We're trying to raise $250,000 for the launch of the Whetstone Radio Collective, a podcast network dedicated to global gastronomy, foodways, and origins. We'll see y'all online. I hope you have a great Saturday. And Asana, we love you. Yes, we're building with you too at Diaspora. Brother Keaton, thank y'all
super.
everyone for tuning in. Bye,
Ciao.
Maher. Thank
Thank you.
you. Bye.
Thanks.